The RPG streaked past Roach's head close enough to singe his beard. He dropped flat as the explosion tore through the rocks behind him, showering his back with debris and stone fragments that cut through his uniform. 6 hours ago, this was supposed to be a simple reconnaissance mission in the Kuner province. Walk in quiet, observe Taliban movements in the valley, walk out before dawn. Now 3 of his men were wounded. They were pinned against a ridge with no cover worth mentioning, and the Taliban had them surrounded on 3 sides. Senior Chief Petty Officer Tobias Kendrick had been in the teams for 16 years, and he had never seen an ambush this well coordinated. He crawled on his elbows toward Dante, who was hunched behind a boulder with the radio pressed against his ear, calling for help that was not coming. Another burst of machine gun fire raked across their position, and Roach felt the snap of rounds passing inches above his helmet. "Dante," he said, keeping his voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them. "Tell me you have something." Dante Okonkwo looked at him with eyes that held the first flicker of real fear Roach had ever seen in a young communication specialist. "Every asset is either committed or grounded, Senior Chief. Weather system moved in faster than predicted. The birds at Bagram cannot fly. Before we continue with what happened next, drop a comment and let us know where you are watching from. Maybe you know someone who has served in these mountains, or maybe you have worn the uniform yourself." Roach processed the information in the span of a heartbeat. No air support. No quick reaction force close enough to reach them. 6 SEALs against what his count put at 30-plus enemy fighters with elevated positions and heavy weapons. The math was brutal and simple. From 20 meters to his left, he heard Volkov's sniper rifle crack twice in rapid succession. The Russian-born SEAL was making every round count. But even Yuri could not shoot his way through these odds. They had perhaps 15 minutes of sustainable ammunition left, and the Taliban knew it. They were probing, testing, waiting for the moment when the American guns went quiet. Another RPG screamed overhead, this one impacting the slope above them and sending a cascade of loose rock tumbling down. Roach threw himself over Marcus Thorne, the youngest member of his team, shielding the 25-year-old from the debris with his own body. Thorne had taken shrapnel in his left leg during the initial ambush, and the kid was losing blood faster than the field dressing could contain. "Stay with me, Thorne," Roach said. "We're getting out of this." Thorne's face was pale beneath the dirt and blood, but he managed a weak grin. "You are a terrible liar, Senior Chief." Roach almost smiled. The kid had spirit. They all did. Leon Vasquez was 50 meters down the ridge, laying suppressive fire with calm precision that belied the impossible situation. Dante was still working the radio, cycling through every frequency, reaching out to anyone who might answer. And Volkov kept shooting, each crack of his rifle meaning one less enemy to worry about, even as the Taliban numbers seemed to multiply with every passing minute. Then Dante's expression changed. "Senior Chief," he said, pressing the headset tighter against his ear. "I have someone. Unknown call sign, but they are responding." Roach scrambled to Dante's position, ignoring the rounds snapping through the air around him. "Who is it?" Dante shook his head, confusion evident in his voice. "Call sign Spectre. I do not recognize it. They say they are 23 minutes out. 23 minutes might as well be 23 hours in a firefight. But it was something. It was more than they had 5 seconds ago. "Spectre," Dante said into the radio, "this is Trident 6. We have 6 operators, 3 wounded, pinned by enemy force of 30-plus with heavy weapons. Request immediate close air support." The response came through broken by static, but the words were clear enough. "Trident 6, Spectre copies all. I'm pushing through weather now. Hold your position. Help is coming." Roach grabbed the handset. "Spectre, what asset are you? What are we looking at for support?" The static hissed and crackled. When the voice came back, something about it nagged at Roach, something he could not quite identify. "Spectre is an A10. You will know when I get there. An A10. The Warthog. 30mm cannon that could turn a tank into scrap metal. The most feared close air support platform ever built. If this Spectre could actually make it through the weather that had grounded everyone else, they might have a chance. But that was a massive if. Vasquez's voice cut through on the team frequency. Roach, they are massing on the North Ridge. I count at least 15 additional fighters. They're going to rush us. The Taliban commander, whoever he was, had decided to end this. Roach understood the tactical calculation. Why waste ammunition and risk more casualties when you could simply overwhelm 6 wounded Americans with sheer numbers? He looked at his men. Dante, still working the radio. Volkov methodically acquiring targets. Vasquez holding the line. Thorne bleeding but conscious, pistol in hand, ready to fight until his last breath. These were his brothers. He had trained them, led them, bled with them. And now he was going to watch them die in this valley unless a pilot he had never heard of could do something no one else had managed to do today. Everyone, he called out, listen up. We have air support inbound, 20 minutes. We hold until then. Conserve ammunition, pick your shots, and stay alive. 20 minutes, Vasquez replied. Might as well be forever. Roach checked his magazine. 14 rounds remaining in this one. 2 more magazines after. Maybe 60 shots total to hold off 50 fighters. Then, in the distance, almost lost beneath the gunfire and explosions, he heard something. A low rumble, growing steadily louder. Not helicopter rotors. Something deeper. Something that made the air itself seem to vibrate. Dante heard it too. His eyes went wide. Senior Chief, that sound. Roach knew that sound. Every ground soldier who had ever been in close combat knew that sound. It was salvation wrapped in titanium and depleted uranium. It was the thunder of an angel coming to deliver judgment. The question that none of them could answer was simple but urgent. Who was flying it? And would they make it in time? 34 minutes earlier, Captain Alara Vance sat in the ready room at Bagram Airfield staring at a flight schedule that did not include her name. Again, the third time this week, Major Preston Whitmore had shuffled the roster to keep her grounded, while pilots with half her flight hours took the missions that should have been hers. She heard the radio traffic before anyone told her what was happening. The distress calls coming through the operations center carried that particular edge she had learned to recognize over 3 combat deployments. Men in trouble. Real trouble. The kind where seconds mattered and minutes meant funerals. Alara moved to the doorway of the ops center, listening as the situation in Kuner province deteriorated with every transmission. SEAL team pinned down. Multiple wounded. Enemy forces massing for an assault. And every available aircraft either committed to other operations or grounded by the weather system that had rolled through faster than the meteorologist predicted. She knew what she had to do. Major Whitmore stood near the tactical display, arms crossed, watching the disaster unfold with the detached expression of a man who would write reports about casualties rather than prevent them. Alara approached him with a request already forming on her lips. Sir, she said, I am qualified on the A10 and I am not on the schedule. Let me scramble. Whitmore barely glanced at her. Negative, Captain. The weather ceiling is below minimums. I'm not authorizing any additional launches. Sir, there's 6 men dying out there. And I am not going to add a 7th by sending a pilot into conditions they cannot handle. His eyes finally met hers, and she saw what lived behind them. Not concerned for safety. Something older and uglier. You're not going anywhere, Vance. The dismissal was familiar. She had been hearing variations of it since flight school. Too emotional. Too reckless. Too female. The words changed, but the meaning never did. Men like Whitmore looked at her and saw a quota filled, a checkbox marked, an anomaly to be tolerated rather than a pilot to be trusted. Another burst of radio traffic. The SEAL team leader reporting enemy reinforcements. The desperation bleeding through his professional calm. Alara turned away from Whitmore and found herself facing Lieutenant Colonel Frank Barrera. Her squadron commander stood in the doorway, and from the look on his weathered face, he had heard everything. Ironside, she said, using his call sign without thinking. Those men do not have time for politics. Barrera studied her for a long moment. He was the one who had recognized her talent 4 years ago, who had pushed for her assignment to the A10 community when others wanted her flying cargo planes where she could not cause trouble. He was also the one who knew what drove her, The weight she carried from a mission 2 years past when 47 seconds had meant the difference between life and death for 4 Marines. She saw him cough, a deep rattling sound he tried to suppress. Saw him palm something from his pocket, a pill bottle he thought no one noticed. Barrera was sick. How sick, she did not know. But sick enough that he moved more carefully now, spoke with more urgency, as if he understood that time was a resource he could no longer waste. "Major Whitmore," Barrera said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had earned his rank in cockpits rather than conference rooms. "I am authorizing Captain Vance to scramble." Whitmore spun around. "Colonel, the weather minimums clearly state that no aircraft should launch under current conditions. If something happens to her or that aircraft, it falls on your record." "Then it falls on my record." Barrera did not blink. "Captain Vance, get to your jet. You are cleared for immediate departure." Alara did not wait for Whitmore to protest further. She was already moving, grabbing her flight gear from the ready room, her mind shifting into the focused state that combat demanded. Behind her, she heard Whitmore's voice, sharp with barely contained fury. "This is a mistake, Colonel. She is not ready for conditions like this." Barrera's response was quiet enough that Alara almost missed it. "She was born ready, Preston. You're just too blind to see it." The flight line was chaos organized into purpose. Ground crews working despite the weather, aircraft being prepped and armed with the efficiency that came from doing the same tasks 1,000 times. Alara reached her A10, tail number 820654, and began her pre-flight checks with hands that did not tremble despite the adrenaline flooding her system. Her crew chief, a senior airman named Womack, appeared beside her. "Ma'am, weather advisory says visibility is near zero above the mountains." The other pilots would not take off. Alara climbed into the cockpit. "Then I guess it is good I am not the other pilots." She strapped in, ran through her checks, and reached into the pocket of her flight suit. Her fingers found the familiar shape of her father's aviator wings, the silver worn smooth by years of handling. Colonel Thomas Vance had died in a training accident when she was 12, his F-16 lost to mechanical failure over the Nevada desert. She had been too young to understand then. Now she understood too well. Flying was not about safety. It was about purpose. "Not again," she whispered, gripping the wings for just a moment before tucking them back against her heart. "I will not be late again." The engine spooled up with a sound that always felt like a promise. Alara taxied to the runway, received her clearance, and pushed the throttles forward. The A-10 surged down the concrete and lifted into a sky that wanted to kill her. Within seconds, she was swallowed by clouds so thick she could not see her own wingtips. Turbulence slammed the aircraft sideways. Ice began forming on surfaces that could not afford the weight. Every instrument she had became her only connection to a world reduced to grave violence. Behind her, Bagram disappeared. Ahead, 6 men were counting the seconds until help arrived. Alara Vance flew into the storm. The mountains wanted her dead. Alara could feel it in every shudder of the airframe, every violent gust that tried to flip her aircraft into a spiral she would never recover from. The Hindu Kush had been killing pilots since before she was born, and today it seemed determined to add her name to that long and forgotten list. She flew by instruments alone, trusting the glowing displays when every instinct screamed that she was inverted, diving, lost in a void without reference or mercy. Turbulence slammed her helmet against the canopy hard enough to blur her vision. Ice accumulated on the leading edges of her wings faster than the de-icing systems could clear it. The A-10 was a rugged aircraft, built to absorb punishment that would destroy anything else in the inventory. But even the Warthog had limits. "Spectre, this is Bagram Control. Weather radar shows severe icing conditions along your route. Recommend you abort and return to base." Alara keyed her radio. "Negative, Bagram. Continuing to target area." The controller's voice carried a note of resignation. "Understood, Spectre. Be advised you are beyond our radar coverage in 4 minutes. You will be on your own." She was already on her own. She had been on her own since the moment she chose this life, this path that so few understood and even fewer respected. The storm howled around her, and she howled back in silence, her hands steady on the controls as she threaded through mountain passes she could not see. 23 miles to the east, Senior Chief Roach was watching his team die by inches. Volkov had stopped shooting, not because he had given up, but because he had exactly 9 rounds remaining and refused to waste a single one. The sniper lay motionless behind his rifle. I pressed to the scope, waiting for a shot that would matter. Beside him, Vasquez had taken a grazing wound across his shoulder, blood soaking through his uniform and a spreading stain he ignored with the discipline of a man who had bled before and would bleed again. The Taliban had grown bolder. Their fire was more accurate now, more sustained. They could smell the end coming, and they were eager to deliver it. Thorne's breathing had grown shallow. The young SEAL was losing consciousness despite Dante's efforts to keep him talking, keep him present, keep him alive long enough for help that might never come. The field dressing on his leg was soaked through, and they had nothing left to replace it with. Roach moved between positions, checking on each man, offering words he was not sure he believed. 15 minutes, he told them. 15 minutes, and that aircraft will be here. But 15 minutes was an eternity when you were bleeding out on a mountainside 10,000 miles from home. He found himself thinking about his wife, about the last conversation they had before this deployment. She had asked him when he was going to stop, when he was going to choose her over the teams. He had not given her an answer because he did not have one. The truth was that this life, this brotherhood, this purpose was the only thing he understood anymore. Without it, he was just a man with too many memories and not enough reasons to keep making new ones. A burst of machine gun fire kicked up dirt inches from his boot. Roach dropped flat, crawled to new cover, and checked his ammunition again. 41 rounds. 41 chances to keep his men breathing until the sky delivered salvation or the mountains swallowed them whole. Somewhere above the clouds, Alara was fighting her own battle. The aircraft bucked and shuddered as she punched through a layer of turbulence that felt like driving into a concrete wall. Warning lights flickered across her displays. The ice was winning, adding weight to her wings, degrading her lift, pushing her closer to a stall with every passing second. She climbed, searching for clearer air, and found only more violence. Then, without warning, she broke through. The clouds parted like a curtain, and suddenly she could see. Mountains stretched in every direction, their peaks white with snow, their valleys deep with shadow. And there, 15 miles ahead, a column of smoke rising from a ridgeline where tiny figures traded fire in a dance as old as war itself. Spectre has visual on the target area, she transmitted. Beginning my descent. She pushed the nose down, letting gravity add speed as she evaluated the tactical situation below. What she saw made her stomach tighten. The SEAL team was trapped on a narrow ridge with enemy positions on 3 sides. She counted muzzle flashes from at least 40 different points. Heavy machine guns on the northern ridge. RPG teams scattered throughout the rocks. And on the valley floor, more fighters moving to join the assault. It was worse than the radio traffic had suggested. Far worse. Trident 6, this is Spectre. I am on station. Give me your position and mark enemy locations. The response came immediately, the relief in the voice unmistakable. Spectre, Trident 6. We are on the eastern ridge, marked by orange smoke. Enemy concentrations are north and west, with reinforcements approaching from the south. Alara watched the orange smoke bloom against the brown terrain. She had them. Now, she needed to keep them alive. Copy, Trident 6. Stand by for gun run. Keep your heads down. She banked hard, lining up her approach on the northern ridge where the heaviest fire originated. The A10 responded to her inputs with the eager aggression that made it the most feared aircraft in the ground support role. 30 millimeters of pure destruction waited in the nose, and Alara intended to use every round if that was what it took. The targeting reticle settled over the enemy position. Her finger moved to the trigger, and then the first RPG rose to meet her. Alara saw the RPG's smoke trail and reacted before conscious thought could catch up. She rolled the aircraft hard left, pulling forces that pressed her into the ejection seat with crushing weight, and watched the rocket pass close enough to see the fins spinning. A miss measured in feet, not yards. She completed the roll and realigned on target. The Taliban gunner who had fired was already reloading, and she intended to make sure he never got the chance. Her thumb found the trigger. The GAU-8 Avenger roared to life. The sound was unlike anything else in modern warfare. A deep, tearing buzz that seemed to rip the fabric of the air itself. 30mm rounds poured from the nose of the A-10 at nearly 4,000 per minute, each shell the size of a small bottle, each one capable of punching through armor plate like paper. The northern ridge disappeared in a storm of explosions and debris. On the ground, Roach heard it before he understood it. The distinctive sound reached his ears a full second after the impacts began, a thunderous BRRT that every infantryman learned to love and every enemy learned to fear. He pressed himself flat against the rocks and watched the enemy position vanish in a wall of fire and smoke. Volkov actually laughed. That, he said in his faint accent, is the most beautiful sound in the world. The machine gun fire from the north stopped completely. Alara pulled up, banked around, and assessed the damage. The heavy weapons position that had been pinning the SEALs was gone, replaced by a smoking crater and scattered debris. But the enemy fighters on the western ridge were already adjusting, shifting their fire toward the sky. Spectre, Trident 6. Good effect on target. Enemy repositioning to the west. Copy, Trident 6. Coming around for another pass. She lined up again, this time targeting a cluster of fighters who had made the mistake of grouping together behind a rock formation. The A-10 dove toward them with the patience of a predator who knew its prey had nowhere to run. Alara squeezed the trigger in controlled bursts, walking her fire across the enemy position with surgical precision. More explosions, more silence where gunfire had been. Roach watched through his scope as the western ridge transformed from a threat into a memory. Whoever was flying that aircraft understood close air support at a level he had rarely witnessed. The pilot was not just dropping ordnance from safe altitude. They were down in the weeds, taking fire, making passes that required skill and courage in equal measure. "Who is this pilot?" he muttered. Dante shook his head. "Call sign Spectre. That is all I have, Senior Chief. I have never heard it before." Roach keyed his radio. "Spectre, Trident 6. Outstanding work. Be advised you are taking ground fire from multiple positions." The response crackled through static. "Copy the ground fire, Trident 6. I see them." There was something about the voice that nagged at Roach. Something familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. The static made it impossible to identify, but the calm professionalism was unmistakable. This was not some nervous pilot on their first combat mission. This was someone who had done this before, someone who understood the stakes. Alara came around for her third pass, and that was when she saw the village. It sat at the northern edge of the valley, a collection of mud brick buildings that looked ancient and fragile against the harsh mountain landscape. And between those buildings and the SEAL position, Taliban fighters were using civilians as cover, moving through the streets with weapons visible and women and children nearby. Her finger hesitated on the trigger. "Spectre, this is Trident 6. We have enemy movement near the village. Can you engage?" Alara studied the scene through her targeting display. She could see the fighters clearly. She could also see the family huddled in a doorway 30 meters away, the children clutching their mother, the old man standing in front of them as if his frail body could stop bullets. "Negative, Trident 6. I have civilians in the target area. I need you to mark hostile positions only. I will not fire blind into that village." There was a pause on the radio. Then Roach's voice came back, and she heard something in it that might have been respect. "Understood, Spectre. Stand by." She circled overhead, watching the tactical picture evolve. The Taliban commander, whoever he was, had recognized the threat she posed. He was pulling his fighters back toward the village, using the civilian population as a shield. It was a coward's tactic, but it was effective. Every rule of engagement she operated under, every principle she believed in, prevented her from pursuing. From his position on the mountainside, a man named Khalid Massoud watched the American aircraft circle and allowed himself a thin smile. He had fought the Americans for 15 years and learned their weaknesses. They were powerful, yes. Their technology was overwhelming, but they were soft where it mattered. They cared about the wrong things. He issued orders to his men. Concentrate fire on the aircraft. Bring it down, and the soldiers on the ridge would be helpless. RPG teams began repositioning, spreading out to create overlapping fields of fire. Heavy machine guns were dragged to new positions with clear sight lines to the sky. The trap was being reset, and this time the bait was the A10 itself. Alara saw the movements below and understood immediately what was happening. Trident 6, be advised enemy, is concentrating anti-aircraft assets. I count 6 RPG teams and at least 3 heavy machine gun positions orienting on my flight path. Can you engage, Spectre? She checked her ammunition counter. Still plenty of rounds remaining. Plenty of fuel. The question was not whether she could engage. The question was whether she could survive the engagement. The answer did not matter. Those men on the ridge were counting on her. Affirmative, Trident 6. I am engaging. She pushed the nose down and dove directly into the teeth of the enemy fire. The sky around Alara erupted in fire and metal. Tracer rounds streaked past her canopy in glowing streams, close enough that she could feel their heat through the glass. RPGs corkscrewed upward from multiple positions, their smoke trails crisscrossing like a deadly web designed to catch her no matter which way she turned. She did not turn. She flew straight through. The GAU-8 roared again, and the first RPG team disappeared in a cloud of dust and fragmented rock. She walked her fire to the right, catching a machine gun position mid-burst, silencing it permanently. Rounds punched through her left wing, the impact sounding like hammer blows against sheet metal, but the A-10 kept flying. It was built for this. So was she. Pull up, the voice in her head screamed. Pull up and get clear. She ignored it. There was another RPG team below, already tracking her, and if she broke off now, they would have a clean shot at her tail. Better to face the enemy hidden where her cannon could answer. The trigger depressed. The gun sang its terrible song. The RPG team ceased to exist. Only then did she pull back on the stick, climbing hard, checking her systems with quick glances at displays that showed more amber warnings than she wanted to count. Left wing had taken damage. Hydraulic pressure was fluctuating. Fuel consumption had increased, which meant a leak somewhere she could not see. The aircraft was hurt, but it was still flying. That was enough. Spectre, Trident 6. We lost visual on you. What's your status? Alara checked her mirrors, saw the smoke trailing from her wing, and made a decision about what to share. Spectre is still in the fight, Trident 6. Stand by for continued support. On the ridge, Roach let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. For a long moment, as the aircraft disappeared into the chaos of explosions and tracer fire, he had been certain they were about to watch their salvation spiral into the mountainside. The fact that the pilot was still flying, still fighting, after taking that kind of punishment, spoke to something beyond mere skill. Dante looked at him with an expression that mixed relief with disbelief. Senior Chief, that pilot just flew through concentrated anti-aircraft fire without breaking off. Who does that? Roach shook his head. Someone who does not know how to quit. But even as he said it, a new problem was emerging. Movement on the southern slope caught his eye, and when he raised the scope to look, his stomach dropped. Reinforcements. A lot of them. Fighters pouring down from a trail he had not even known existed. At least 30 more guns joining a fight that was already overwhelming. Spectre, Trident 6. We have enemy reinforcements approaching from the south. TFT plus fighter. Our situation is becoming untenable. Alara saw them too. The fresh troops, moving with the confidence of men who believed victory was certain. They would reach effective range in minutes, and when they did, the SEALs would be caught in a crossfire from 3 directions with nowhere to hide. She checked her ammunition. The counter showed less than she wanted. Enough for maybe 2 more effective gun runs, if she was conservative. After that, she would be Winchester, empty, Nothing but an expensive noisemaker circling overhead. The smart move was obvious. Make one more pass. Expend her remaining ammunition on the reinforcements. Then return to Bagram for rearming and refueling. Standard procedure. By the book. But by the book meant leaving those men alone for at least an hour. And she knew, with the certainty that came from having lived this nightmare before, that they did not have an hour. 47 seconds. That was how long she had been late to a similar situation 2 years ago. A convoy ambush in Helmand province. Marines pinned down, calling for help. She had been diverted from another mission, pushing her aircraft as fast as it could go, and she had arrived 47 seconds after the last Marine stopped breathing. 4 men dead because she was 47 seconds too slow. She had watched the gun camera footage 100 times, had memorized the faces from their service records, had written letters to families who would never know that their sons and husbands had died waiting for her. The weight of those 47 seconds had never left her. It rode with her on every mission, sat beside her in every cockpit, whispered to her in every moment of doubt. Not again. She had made that promise to herself, to their memory, to the wings she carried against her heart. Not again. Trident 6, Spectre. I am engaging the reinforcements. After this pass, I will be Winchester on ammunition. Copy, Spectre. Medevac is still 40 minutes out. Can you remain on station? The question hung in the air between them, separated by miles of mountain and sky, but connected by the desperate math of survival. 40 minutes. No ammunition. A damaged aircraft that was burning fuel faster than it should. Alara thought about Whitmore, about his warning that she would be on her own if something went wrong. She thought about Barrera, sick and fighting for her career with whatever time he had left. She thought about her father, about the wings in her pocket, about promises made to ghosts. Affirmative, Trident 6. I'm staying on station until you are out of there. The silence on the radio lasted 3 seconds. When Roach spoke again, his voice had changed. There was something in it that had not been there before. Spectre, Trident 6 copies. And thank you. She did not answer. She was already diving toward the reinforcement column, her finger on the trigger, her eyes fixed on the men who would never reach that ridge if she had anything to say about it. The gun roared one final time, and the southern slope erupted in devastation. The reinforcement column shattered under a final gun run. Bodies and debris scattered across the southern slope, and the fighters who survived broke formation, scrambling for cover that did not exist. Alara pulled up hard, climbing away from the carnage, and watched her ammunition counter hit 0. Winchester. The word every attack pilot dreaded. She had nothing left but fuel, engines, and the shadow of an aircraft that had already proven what it could do. Spectre is Winchester, she transmitted. All ammunition expended. The reply came from Dante, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. Copy, Spectre. What are your intentions? Alara looked down at the valley. The Taliban forces had been devastated, but not destroyed. She could still see movement among the rocks, fighters regrouping, gathering their courage now that the terrible gun had fallen silent. They would figure out soon enough that she had nothing left to shoot, and when they did, they would resume their assault on the ridge. Remaining on station, Trident 6. I will provide what support I can. Roach heard the transmission and frowned. Support without weapons meant nothing. The pilot was staying to watch them die, and he could not understand why anyone would choose that. But before he could respond, the A10 dove toward the valley floor. Alara pushed the throttles forward, dropping to an altitude so low that her wingtips nearly scraped the rocks. She roared over a group of Taliban fighters at 300 knots, close enough to see the whites of their eyes, and watch them scatter in panic. They did not know she was empty. They only knew that the monster was coming, and the monster had already killed dozens of their brothers. She pulled up, banked hard, and came around for another pass. Different group this time, fighters who had been moving toward the ridge. They dove for cover as her shadow passed over them, convinced that death was a trigger pull away. It was a bluff, the most dangerous bluff of her life. But it was working. On the ridge, Vasquez watched the aircraft make pass after pass without firing. It took him a moment to understand what he was seeing, and when he did, his jaw went slack. "Senior Chief," he said, "that pilot is dry. No ammunition. They are making dummy runs to keep the enemy suppressed." Roach stared at the sky. The A-10 screamed overhead, engine noise alone enough to send fighters scrambling for cover. The pilot was using the aircraft itself as a weapon, trading altitude and fuel for time, buying minutes with nothing but noise and courage. He had seen a lot of bravery in 16 years. He had never seen anything like this. "Spectre, Trident 6. What is your fuel state?" The response took a moment. "Lower than I would like." "But enough." The static cleared for just a second as she spoke, and something in her voice made Roach pause. Something he almost recognized, but could not place. Before he could think about it further, the aircraft was diving again, sending another group of fighters running for their lives. From his position overlooking the valley, Khalid Massoud watched the American aircraft with narrowed eyes. He had noticed that the gun had stopped firing. He had counted the passes without ordnance. And unlike his frightened men, he understood what it meant. "The aircraft is empty," he called to his fighters. "It has no weapons. Return to your positions and finish the Americans." But his men hesitated. They had watched that aircraft tear their brothers apart with fire from heaven. The sound of its engine was the sound of death itself. Empty or not, they feared it more than they feared Massoud's anger. He would have to show them himself. Massoud raised his RPG launcher, tracked the aircraft through its turn, and waited for the optimal shot. The American pilot was predictable now, flying the same pattern, making the same passes. A pattern could be exploited. A pattern could be killed. The A-10 came around again, dropping low for another dummy run. Massoud steadied his aim, exhaled slowly, and fired. Alara saw the smoke trail too late. She broke hard right, but the RPG was already close, already detonating, and the explosion ripped through her tail section with a sound like the world ending. The aircraft shuddered violently. Warning alarms screamed in her ears. She fought the controls as the A-10 began to yaw, fought with every ounce of skill she possessed, and somehow, impossibly, kept the aircraft in the air. "Spectre is hit," she transmitted, her voice strained but steady. "Tail damage. Flight controls compromised. I am still flying." The radio erupted with voices. Vagram control urging her to eject. Dante calling her position. Roach tried to raise her through the chaos. She ignored all of them, focused entirely on keeping her wounded aircraft aloft, on staying over that ridge until the men below were safe. "Spectre, Trident 6 actual." Roach's voice cut through the noise, using the formal call sign to demand her attention. "You need to get out of here. You have done enough. More than enough." Alara's hands were shaking on the stick. Her aircraft was dying around her, systems failing one by one. Every instinct screamed at her to turn for Bagram, to save herself while she still could. She thought about the 47 seconds, about the faces she would never forget. "Negative, Trident 6. I am not leaving until you are on a bird out of here. That is not negotiable." The static cleared again, perfectly this time, and her voice came through without distortion, clear and calm and unmistakably female. Roach froze. Beside him, Dante looked up from the radio with wide eyes. Vasquez stopped reloading his weapon. Even Volkov turned from his scope. The pilot who had flown through weather that grounded everyone else, who had torn through enemy positions with surgical precision, who had stayed on station with an empty gun, making dummy runs to buy them time, who had taken fire and kept flying when any sane person would have turned for home. The pilot who had saved all of their lives was a woman. Roach keyed his radio, his voice quiet. "Spectre, who are you?" The response came through crystal clear, carrying with it the weight of everything she had done and everything she had yet to do. Just someone who was not going to be late this time. The medevac helicopter appeared on the horizon like a promise made flesh. Roach saw it first, the distinctive silhouette of a black hawk cutting through the mountain air, and for the first time since the ambush began, he allowed himself to believe they might actually survive. "Trident 6, this is Dustoff 2-4. We are 5 minutes out. Mark your position with smoke. Dante popped the last orange smoke grenade they had, and the colored cloud billowed up from the ridge like a beacon of hope. Around them, the Taliban fighters had finally understood that the circling aircraft was toothless. They were moving again, advancing through the rocks, emboldened by the silence of the gun that had terrorized them. But they were too late. 5 minutes was not enough time to close the distance. The SEALs were going to make it. Roach looked up at the A-10, still circling overhead, trailing smoke from its wounded tail, and felt something shift in his chest. For 16 years, he had carried a hatred for Air Force pilots that he had never questioned. It had calcified into certainty after that day, in 2009, after the bomb that fell on the wrong coordinates and turned his best friend into a memory. He had blamed them all, every pilot who had ever called in ordnance, every officer who had signed off on close air support. It was easier than blaming the chaos of war itself. Now a woman he had never met was dying in the sky to keep him alive, and everything he thought he knew felt like a lie. The helicopter touched down in a storm of dust and noise. Roach grabbed Thorne under the arms and dragged him toward the open door, Vasquez helping despite his wounded shoulder. Volkov provided cover, his rifle cracking methodically, buying seconds with the last of his ammunition. Dante was already aboard, pulling Thorne inside, making room for the others. "Senior Chief, come on," Vasquez shouted over the rotor wash. Roach hesitated at the door, looking up one more time. The A-10 was lower now, struggling to maintain altitude, its flight path erratic in a way that spoke of failing systems and desperate measures. He keyed his radio. "Spectre, Trident 6. We are on the bird. Get yourself home." The response was barely audible over the helicopter noise, but he heard it. "Copy, Trident 6. Good luck." Then the Black Hawk lifted off, and Roach watched the woman who had saved them become a shrinking silhouette against the Afghan sky. Alara watched the helicopter climb away from the ridge, carrying 6 men who would see their families again because she had refused to quit. The relief lasted exactly 3 seconds before the next warning alarm demanded her attention. Hydraulic pressure was critical. Fuel was critical. The entire tail section was held together by luck and titanium, and both were running out. She turned toward Bagram, nursing the throttle, coaxing every mile she could from an aircraft that should have fallen out of the sky 10 minutes ago. "Spectre, Bagram Control. Say your status." She almost laughed. Her status was impossible. Her status was a miracle wrapped in failing metal. But pilots did not say things like that on open radio. "Bagram, Spectre. I have multiple system failures and battle damage to the tail. Request priority handling and emergency equipment standing by." "Copy, Spectre. You are cleared direct." Emergency crews are rolling. The mountains pass beneath her, familiar and foreign all at once. She had flown this route dozens of times, but never like this. Never with her hands shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. Never with the stick fighting her on every input. Never with the certainty that each second might be her last. Her father's wings pressed against her chest, warm from her body heat, and she thought about the day she had received them. Her mother's hands trembling as she placed them in her palm. Her mother's voice, barely a whisper. "He would want you to have these. He always said you had the sky in your blood." She had been 12 years old and devastated. Now she was 29 and flying through the consequences of choice her father would have understood. He had died doing what he loved, pushing an aircraft to its limits because the mission demanded it. She had always known she might die the same way. But not today. Not if she had anything to say about it. The runway appeared ahead, a gray ribbon cutting through the brown landscape. Alara lined up her approach, extended her landing gear, and felt the aircraft shudder as damaged hydraulics struggled to comply. 2 green lights, 1 amber. The nose gear was down, but not locked. She could eject. The thought crossed her mind and left just as quickly. If she punched out now, the aircraft would crash uncontrolled. It might hit something, someone. She had not flown through hell to cause more death at the end. "Bagram, Spectre. Nose gear shows unsafe. I'm going to bring it in anyway." The controller's voice was carefully neutral, professionally calm in the way that meant he was terrified for her. Understood, Spectre. Emergency crews standing by. Good luck. She crossed the threshold low and slow, feeling the aircraft sink toward the concrete with all the grace of a wounded bird. The main gear touched first, held, and she eased the nose down with agonizing care. For one eternal second, nothing happened. Then the nose gear collapsed. The aircraft slammed forward, sparks erupting as metal met runway at 100 knots. Alara fought the controls, keeping the wings level, riding the disintegrating wreckage as it screamed down the concrete, trailing fire and debris. The world became noise and violence, and she held on with everything she had. When the A10 finally ground to a stop, she was still alive. She sat in the cockpit, surrounded by smoke and the smell of burning hydraulic fluid, and let her hands fall from the controls. They were shaking so badly she could not have held a cup of water. Her breath came in ragged gasps that fogged her visor. Every muscle in her body ached from the strain of fighting an aircraft that had tried to die for the last 30 minutes. But she had brought it home. She had brought them all home. Alara reached into her flight suit and pulled out her father's wings. She pressed them to her lips, closed her eyes, and whispered the only words that mattered. "I was not late, Dad. Not this time." The fire crews reached her before she could climb out of the cockpit. Hands pulled her from the wreckage, guided her away from the smoking aircraft, sat her down on the tarmac where medics swarmed with flashlights and questions. She answered automatically, her mind still somewhere over that valley, still circling, still fighting. Someone draped a blanket over her shoulders. Someone else pressed water into her hands. She drank without tasting, her eyes fixed on the ruined A10 that had carried her through the impossible and given everything it had. Then she saw Whitmore. He was striding across the tarmac with the purposeful gait of a man who had already decided how this conversation would end. His face was a mask of controlled fury, the kind that came from having his authority challenged and his judgment overruled. Behind him, a small crowd had gathered. Pilots, ground crew, officers who had heard the radio traffic and come to see the woman who had done what no one else would. "Captain Vance." Whitmore's voice cut through the noise like a blade. "On your feet." Alara stood, letting the blanket fall from her shoulders. Her flight suit was soaked with sweat, her hair plastered to her forehead, her hands still trembling from the adrenaline that had not yet faded. She looked like exactly what she was. A pilot who had just survived something that should have killed her. "Sir." Whitmore stopped 2 feet away, close enough that she could see the vein pulsing in his temple. "Do you have any idea what you have done? You disobeyed a direct order. You flew into conditions that were explicitly deemed unsafe. You destroyed a $30 million aircraft. I saved 6 lives, sir." The words came out steady, calm, without a trace of the defiance that burned in her chest. She had learned long ago that men like Whitmore could not be fought with anger. They thrived on it, used it as proof that women were too emotional for combat. The only weapon that worked against them was the cold truth. Whitmore's eyes narrowed. "You put yourself at unnecessary risk. You put Air Force assets at unnecessary risk. And you did it against my explicit instructions. Your instructions would have left 6 Navy SEALs dead on a mountainside." The crowd had grown larger. Word was spreading through the base like wildfire. The female pilot who flew through the storm. The female pilot who stayed on station with an empty gun. The female pilot who crash-landed a crippled aircraft and walked away. They were watching now, dozens of eyes fixed on this confrontation, and Whitmore knew it. His voice dropped lower, meant for her ears alone. "I warned you, Vance. I told you that if something went wrong, it would be on your record. I'm going to make sure you never fly again." Alara met his gaze without flinching. "Then I guess it is good that I'm not the one who has something to hide, sir." Something flickered in Whitmore's expression. Fear, maybe, or recognition that she knew more than he wanted her to know. Before he could respond, a new voice entered the conversation. "That is enough, Major." Lieutenant Colonel Barrera stepped through the crowd, moving slowly but with an authority that made Whitmore straighten instinctively. The squadron commander looked worse than he had that morning. His face was pale, his breathing labored, but his eyes were sharp and clear. "Colonel," Whitmore began, "this pilot violated direct orders and destroyed government property. Regulations clearly state that disciplinary action must be taken when an officer engages in reckless behavior that endangers assets and personnel." Barrera stopped beside Alara, and for a moment his hand rested on her shoulder. A gesture so brief that most observers would have missed it. A gesture that said everything about what she meant to him. "What I saw today, Major, was a pilot who demonstrated extraordinary courage under fire, who flew into conditions that grounded every other aircraft on this base, who provided close air support that saved the lives of 6 American special operators, who stayed on station with no ammunition, taking enemy fire until those men were extracted safely, and who then flew a critically damaged aircraft back to base and landed it without causing a single additional casualty." He turned to face the crowd, raising his voice so everyone could hear. "That is not reckless behavior, Major. That is heroism, and I will be recommending Captain Vance for the Distinguished Fly Cross." The silence that followed was deafening. Whitmore's face had gone pale, his carefully constructed narrative crumbling in front of the entire base. He opened his mouth to protest, but Barrera was not finished. "Furthermore, I am ordering a review of flight scheduling practices in this squadron. It has come to my attention that certain pilots have been systematically excluded from combat rotations despite being fully qualified. That review will be thorough, and it will be transparent." The implication was clear to everyone watching. Whitmore had been caught, and he knew it. His eyes darted to the crowd, to the faces that had once looked at him with respect, and found something else entirely. Suspicion. Judgment. The beginning of an end he had never seen coming. "This is not over," he said quietly. The words meant only for Alara. She looked at him with the calm certainty of a woman who had faced death and won. "No, sir. I do not imagine it is." Whitmore turned and walked away, his shoulders rigid, his stride no longer confident. The crowd parted for him, but no one followed. He was already alone, even surrounded by people. Barrera watched him go, then turned back to Alara. His expression softened, and for just a moment she saw the toll that this day had taken on him. The toll that every day was taking now. "You did good, Captain. Your father would be proud." Alara felt the words hit her somewhere deep, in a place she usually kept locked away. "Thank you, sir, for everything." He nodded once, then walked away, and she noticed for the first time how carefully he moved, how much effort each step required. The secret he was keeping was getting harder to hide. But that was a problem for another day. Right now, she was alive. The men she had saved were alive. And somewhere on this base, word was spreading about what had really happened in the skies over Kuner province. The truth had a way of finding the light, no matter how hard some people try to bury it. 3 days after the extraction, Roach learned that the pilot who saved his team was facing a formal investigation. The news reached him at FOB Wright, delivered by a Navy lieutenant who thought he was sharing routine information. Captain Alara Vance, call sign Spectre, had been accused of reckless endangerment and destruction of military property. A Major Whitmore had filed the complaint within hours of her landing. The investigation was already underway. Roach listened to every word, his expression neutral, his blood running cold. When the lieutenant finished, he simply nodded and walked away. He found Vasquez in the medical tent, getting his shoulder redressed by a corpsman who was telling him he should have been evacuated to Bagram. "Get the team together," Roach said. "We're going to the airfield." Vasquez did not ask why. He had known Roach long enough to recognize the tone that meant something important was happening. Within an hour, all 6 members of Trident 6 were loaded onto a helicopter heading for Bagram. Thorne came too, despite having a hole in his leg that should have kept him bedridden. The young SEAL had refused to stay behind when he learned where they were going and why. "She saved my life," he said simply. "I can stand on one leg long enough to return the favor." They landed at Bagram as the sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of orange and gold. Roach led his team across the base with the purposeful stride of a man on a mission, and anyone who saw them coming knew better than to get in the way. 6 SEALs in combat gear, faces set like stone, moving toward the building where military justice was being administered. The investigation officer was a JAG captain named Morrison, a woman with tired eyes and a stack of paperwork that spoke to a career spent navigating the space between regulations and reality. She looked up when Roach entered her office, and something in her expression shifted when she saw the man behind him. "Senior Chief Kendrick," she said, "I was not expecting visitors." Roach remained standing. "Ma'am, I understand you are investigating Captain Vance for actions taken during our extraction 3 days ago." "That is correct. The investigation is ongoing, and I cannot discuss details without side parties." "Then let me give you some details you might not have." Roach stepped forward, placing his hands on her desk. "I have been in the teams for 16 years. I have worked with dozens of pilots across every branch of service. And I have never, not once, seen anyone do what Captain Vance did in that valley." Morrison leaned back in her chair, studying him. "Go on." "She flew through weather that grounded every other aircraft on this base. She engaged enemy positions with precision that saved our lives multiple times. When she ran out of ammunition, she stayed on station, making dry passes to keep the enemy suppressed. She took critical damage to her aircraft and refused to leave until we were extracted. And then she flew that crippled bird back here and landed it without hurting anyone." Roach's voice had risen without him realizing it. He took a breath, steadied himself. "That is not reckless endangerment, ma'am. That is the definition of valor under fire." Morrison's pen had stopped moving. She was watching him with an intensity that suggested she was hearing something very different from what Whitmore's complaint had described. Behind Roach, Dante stepped forward. "Ma'am, I was the JDAC on that mission. I was in direct communication with Captain Vance throughout the engagement. Every decision she made was tactically sound. Every gun run was precisely executed. She asked for confirmation before engaging near civilian areas. She operated with more discipline than pilots, with twice her experience." Vasquez spoke next, his wounded arm held carefully against his chest. "I've been shot at by a lot of people, ma'am, and I've been saved by close air support more times than I can count. What Captain Vance did was not reckless. It was the bravest thing I have ever witnessed." One by one, they gave their testimony. Volkov, the quiet sniper, describing the 17 individual targets he had counted her eliminating. Thorne, leaning on a crutch, explaining how her intervention had come at the exact moment when all hope seemed lost. Even the youngest member of the team, a petty officer who had said barely 10 words since the extraction, found his voice long enough to say what everyone was thinking. She did not have to stay. She chose to stay. That is not something you punish, ma'am. That is something you honor. Morrison was silent for a long moment after the last man finished speaking. Her eyes moved across their faces, taking in the wounds, the exhaustion, the absolute conviction in every word they had said. Finally, she spoke. "I appreciate you coming forward, gentlemen. Your testimony will be included in the official record." Roach met her gaze. "What happens now?" "Now I do my job, Senior Chief. And I suggest you let me do it." It was a dismissal, but not an unkind one. Roach recognized the look in her eyes. She had heard what she needed to hear. The truth was finally part of the official record, and no amount of bureaucratic maneuvering could remove it now. As they filed out of the office, Vasquez fell in a step beside him. "Think it will make a difference?" Roach thought about the woman who had flown into hell for strangers, who had stayed when leaving would have been easier, who had given everything she had and nearly died because 6 men she had never met needed her help. "It already has," he said quietly. "For all of us." The investigation ended on a Tuesday morning, 7 days after the mission that started it all. Captain Morrison delivered the findings personally, standing before a room that included Alara, Barrera, and a visibly uncomfortable Major Whitmore. The conclusion was unambiguous. Captain Alara Vance had acted in accordance with the highest traditions of military service. All charges were dismissed. The matter was closed. But Morrison was not finished. During the course of this investigation, she continued, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone about to detonate a bomb. Additional information came to light regarding flight scheduling practices within the squadron. Evidence suggests a pattern of discrimination in combat rotation assignments, specifically targeting female pilots. Whitmore's face drained of color. This evidence has been forwarded to the Inspector General's office for further review. Major Whitmore, you are hereby relieved of scheduling authority pending the outcome of that investigation. The room was silent. Alara watched Whitmore's carefully constructed world collapse in real time. Other pilots had come forward once the investigation began, women who had experienced the same systematic exclusion she had faced. Their testimony painted a picture of a man who had used his position to ensure that certain pilots never got the chance to prove themselves in combat. He had hidden it well for years. He would not hide any longer. Whitmore left the room without a word, his career effectively over even if the formal process would take months to complete. Alara felt no satisfaction watching him go. Only a quiet relief that the next generation of female pilots would not face the same invisible barriers she had been forced to overcome. Barrera found her afterward, outside the building where the sun was doing its best to warm the Afghan morning. He looked tired, more tired than she had ever seen him, but there was a light in his eyes that had nothing to do with his illness. "You did it," he said. "Not just the mission. All of it. We did it, sir. I would not be standing here without you." He shook his head. "I just opened the door, Alara. You're the one who walked through it." There was something in his voice that made her throat tighten, a finality that suggested this might be one of the last conversations they would have like this. She wanted to ask about the pills, about the coughing, about the way he moved like a man carrying weight no one else could see. But some questions were not hers to ask. "There is someone who wants to meet you," Barrera said. "Several someones, actually. They're waiting in the ready room." Alara knew who it would be before she opened the door. They stood when she entered. 6 men in Navy uniforms, their faces marked by the particular exhaustion that came from surviving something that should have killed them. She recognized them from the intelligence photos she had studied before the mission, but seeing them in person was different. They were real, alive, standing in front of her because of choices she had made in a cockpit miles above their heads. Roach stepped forward first. He was older than she had imagined, with weathered features and eyes that had seen more than most people could comprehend. He moved with the careful economy of a man who had learned that every motion mattered, every decision counted. When he stopped in front of her, close enough to shake hands, he did not extend his arm immediately. Instead, he studied her face for a long moment, looking for something, finding it. "Senior Chief Petty Officer Tobias Kendrick," he said finally. "Call sign Roach. You saved my team, Captain Vance." Alara met his gaze. "Just doing my job, Senior Chief." "No." The word came out hard, almost angry. "What you did was not just a job. I have been working with Air Force pilots for 16 years. I have seen good ones and bad ones and everything in between. I have never seen anyone do what you did in that valley." He paused, and something shifted in his expression, something that looked almost like pain. "I spent a long time hating your branch," he continued, his voice quieter now. "Lost a friend to a close air support mistake back in '09. Told myself every Air Force pilot was the same. Careless, distant, more worried about their own safety than the guys on the ground." Alara said nothing. She understood that he needed to finish. "You proved me wrong." Roach extended his hand, "and I'm grateful for it." She took his hand, felt the calluses and strength of a man who had spent his life in service, and shook it firmly. "Thank you, Senior Chief. That means more than you know." One by one, the others approached. Dante, who had been her voice on the radio, thanking her for answering when no one else would. Vasquez, his arms still in a sling, telling her that his daughter would grow up knowing the name Alara Vance. Volkov, silent as ever, simply nodding with respect that needed no words. And finally, Thorne, the youngest, the one she had watched bleeding out through her targeting display, wondering if she would reach him in time. He limped forward on his crutch, his leg wrapped in bandages that would leave scars he would carry for the rest of his life. When he reached her, he did not shake her hand. Instead, he wrapped his arms around her in a hug that caught her completely off guard. "I get to go home because of you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I get to see my mom again, my little sister. I get to have a life." Alara hugged him back, and for the first time since the mission, she let herself feel the weight of what she had done. Not the tactical decisions or the flying skills. The human reality of 6 men who would grow old because she had refused to give up. When Thorne finally released her, Roach reached into his pocket and produced something small. A coin, worn smooth by years of handling. He pressed it in her palm, and she looked down to see the Navy SEAL trident gleaming in the fluorescent light. "That is not given lightly," Roach said. "Welcome to the family, Captain." Alara closed her fingers around the coin, feeling its weight, understanding its meaning. In 16 years, this man had never given one of these to an Air Force pilot. She was the first. She intended to make sure she was not the last. 1 week after the investigation closed, Barrera called her to his office. She knew something was wrong the moment she walked in. He was sitting behind his desk, but the strength that had always defined him seemed diminished somehow. Smaller. The man who had faced down generals and bureaucrats and enemies of every kind looked like he was finally losing a fight he could not win. "Close the door, Alara. Sit down." She did as he asked, settling into the chair across from him with the growing certainty that this conversation would change things between them forever. Barrera was quiet for a long moment, gathering words that clearly did not come easily. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than she had ever heard it. "I have stage 4 pancreatic cancer, diagnosed 8 months ago. The doctors gave me a year, maybe less." The words hit her like a physical blow. She had suspected something was wrong, had noticed the pills and the coughing and the way he moved more carefully with each passing day. But hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that suspicion never could. "Sir, I had no idea. I am so sorry." He waved off her sympathy with a gesture that was pure Barrera. "Do not be sorry. I have had a good life, a good career. I have seen things and done things that most people cannot imagine. If this is where it ends, I can accept that." But there was something else in his eyes, something he had not said yet. "The reason I'm telling you," he continued, "is because I wanted you to understand why I pushed so hard for you, why I fought Whitmore and everyone like him, why I made sure you got a chance." Alara felt her throat tighten. "Sir, when I found out I was dying, I started thinking about legacy, about what I would leave behind when I was gone. And I realized that all the missions, all the medals, all the years of service, none of that matters as much as the people you help along the way." He leaned forward, and for a moment the old strength was back in his face. "You're going to be one of the great ones, Alara. I knew it the first time I saw you fly. You have something that cannot be taught. Instinct, courage, the willingness to do what needs to be done regardless of the cost. I was not going to let small men with small minds take that away from you." She did not trust herself to speak. The tears she had been holding back were threatening to fall, and she was not sure she could stop them if they started. Barrera reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a folder. Inside was paperwork she recognized. Recommendation forms, evaluation reports, a nomination packet for the Distinguished Flying Cross. "I submitted this yesterday," he said. "It should be approved within the month. But I wanted to give you something else, something that means more to me than any medal." He stood, moving slowly, and walked to a display case on the wall behind his desk. Inside were the artifacts of a 30-year career. Challenge coins from units around the world. Photos with presidents and generals. Commendations and awards that most officers would never see. From the center of the display, he removed a pair of silver wings. His wings, the ones he had earned as a young pilot 4 decades ago, worn smooth by years of service and sacrifice. "These got me through some of the hardest moments of my life," he said, turning to face her. "When I was scared, when I doubted myself, when I wondered if I had what it took to keep going, I would touch these wings and remember why I started flying in the first place." He crossed the room and placed them in her hands. "Now I want you to have them, not to replace your father's wings. Nothing could do that, but to remind you that you are part of something bigger. A lineage, a tradition. And when I'm gone, a piece of me will still be up there with you." Alara looked down at the wings in her palm, their weight far greater than their metal could account for. She thought about her father, about the wings she carried against her heart on every mission. And now she would carry Barrera's wings too. 2 generations of pilots who had believed in her when believing was hard. "Thank you, sir." She finally looked up, and the tears were falling now, but she did not care. "I will make you proud." "You already have," Barrera said. "More than you know." The ceremony took place 2 weeks later on a clear morning at Bagram Airfield. Full military honors. Dress uniforms gleaming in the Afghan sun. A formation of A10s flew overhead in missing man formation, one aircraft breaking away to symbolize the pilot being honored. Alara stood at attention as the citation was read aloud. Her actions on that day in the Kuner province, detailed in language that somehow made them sound both more and less real than they had felt in the moment. The enemy positions destroyed. The lives saved. The aircraft flown beyond its limits and brought home through skill and determination. The Distinguished Flying Cross was pinned to her chest by a general she had never met, a man who shook her hand and told her that pilots like her were the reason the Air Force existed. She thanked him politely and felt almost nothing. The medal was not why she had flown into that storm. But when she looked out at the crowd, she saw faces that meant something. Barrera, seated in the front row because standing for long periods had become too difficult. The SEAL team, all 6 of them in dress uniforms they had traveled across the country to wear. Other female pilots from the base, women who had sent messages of support and gratitude in the days since Whitmore's removal. And in the back, almost hidden, a woman she had not seen in months. Her mother, who had flown from Arizona without telling anyone because she wanted to see her daughter honored for doing what her husband had always believed she could do. After the ceremony, Roach found her in the crowd. He was wearing his dress whites, looking uncomfortable in formal attire, but his eyes held the same warmth they had shown in the ready room. He shook her hand, and she felt something pressed into her palm. When she looked down, she saw the trident coin again, the same one he had given her before. "You gave this back," she said, confused. Roach shook his head. "That one is yours to keep. This one is for your father." Alara stared at him, unable to speak. "A pilot I never met raised a daughter who saved my team," Roach said quietly. "Seems to me he earned it too." She closed her fingers around the coin and held it against her chest, next to the wings that had carried 3 generations of courage into the sky. 6 months later, Alara stood in a classroom at Moody Air Force Base in Georgia, looking out at 20 young pilots who had no idea what they were getting into. The A10 instructor pilot course was considered one of the most demanding programs in the Air Force. Washout rates were brutal. Standards were unforgiving. And for the first time in the program's history, a woman was running it. She had not asked for the assignment. Barrera had arranged it before he died. One final gift from a man who understood that the best way to change an institution was from the inside. Train the next generation. Show them what was possible. Make them better than the ones who came before. Barrera had passed 3 months ago, quietly, in a hospice in Colorado with his wife holding his hand. Alara had been there at the end, sitting beside his bed, holding the wings he had given her. His last words to her had been simple. Go teach them how to fly. So here she was, teaching. The students watched her with expressions that ranged from skepticism to curiosity to barely concealed hostility. She recognized the looks. She had been receiving them her entire career. The difference now was that she no longer cared. My name is Captain Alara Vance, she said, her voice filling the classroom without effort. My call sign is Spectre. Some of you may have heard stories about me. Some of those stories might even be true. A few nervous laughs from the front row. What matters is not what I have done. What matters is what you're going to do. You are here because someone thinks you have what it takes to fly the ugliest, slowest, most effective close air support platform ever built. My job is to find out if they were right. She walked along the front of the classroom, making eye contact with each student in turn. The A10 is not glamorous. It will not make you famous. You will never be a fighter pilot at Top Gun or fly missions that make the evening news. What you will do is save lives. Ground troops, special operators, men and women who are counting on you to be there when everything goes wrong. That is the job. That is the only job that matters. She stopped at the end of the row, where a young woman sat with her back straight and her eyes fixed forward. Lieutenant Amara Osei, top of her flight school class. first in her family to serve. The kind of pilot Alara had been 15 years ago, before the world taught her how hard the path would be. Some of you will wash out, Alara continued. Some of you will decide this is not for you. And some of you will become the best pilots in the Air Force. I do not care which category you fall into, as long as you give me everything you have while you are here. She returned to the front of the room. Any questions? Lieutenant Osei raised her hand. Ma'am, is it true you stayed on station with no ammunition and a damaged aircraft until the ground team was extracted? Alara considered the question. She could deflect it, change the subject, maintain the professional distance that instructors were supposed to keep. But she thought about Barrera, about the stories he had told her when she was young and uncertain. Sometimes the best teaching was not about technique. It was about truth. Yes, she said simply. It is true. Why? Because 6 men were going to die if I left. And I was not willing to let that happen. The room was silent. 20 young pilots looking at her with something new in their eyes. Not skepticism anymore. Something closer to understanding. That is the job, Alara said. That is what I'm going to teach you. Not just how to fly. How to stay when leaving would be easier. How to give everything you have when everything is not enough. How to be the person someone else is counting on. She glanced at the clock on the wall. Class begins tomorrow at 0600. Do not be late. The students filed out, but Lieutenant Osei lingered. She approached Alara's desk with the careful respect of someone who knew they were in the presence of history. Ma'am, I just wanted to say thank you. For being here. For showing us what is possible. Alara looked at her, seeing echoes of herself in the young woman's determined face. Do not thank me yet, Lieutenant. Thank me when you earn your wings. Osei nodded and left, and Alara was alone in the classroom. She walked to her desk, where 3 objects sat in a small display case. Her father's aviator wings, worn smooth by decades of handling. Barrera's wings, still bright with the polish she applied every week. And 2 Trident coins, one for her and one for the father she still missed every day. A letter lay beside the case, arrived that morning from an APO address overseas. She had already read it twice, but she picked it up again anyway. Captain Vance, the letter began. You probably do not remember me, but my name is Marcus Thorne. I was the SEAL you pulled off that ridge in Afghanistan 18 months ago. The one with the hole in his leg and not much hope left. I wanted you to know that I am back with my team. Full duty. The doctor said I would never operate again, but I guess I am as stubborn as you are. We're deployed again, somewhere I cannot name, doing things I cannot talk about. But every time we call for air support, I think about you. I think about what you taught me about never giving up. My sister got married last month. I was there to walk her down the aisle. My mother cried for an hour straight. None of that happens if you had not stayed. I heard you're teaching now. That is good. The world needs more pilots like you. Train them well, Captain. Teach them what you taught me. Some people are worth staying for. Semper Fi. Marcus Thorne, Petty Officer, First Class. U.S. and Alara set the letter down and looked out the window at the flight line, where A10s sat waiting for tomorrow's training missions. Ugly aircraft. Slow aircraft. The most beautiful things she had ever seen. She thought about her father, who had given her the sky. About Barrera, who had given her the chance to claim it. About Roach and Thorne and all the others who had shown her that courage was not about being unafraid. It was about being afraid and staying anyway. Tomorrow she would teach a new generation of pilots how to fly, how to fight, how to be the person someone else was counting on when everything went wrong. And somewhere in cockpits she would never see, her students would remember what she taught them. They would stay when leaving was easier. They would give everything when everything was not enough. They would be the voice on the radio that said help is coming, and they would mean it. That was her legacy now. Not medals or citations or stories told in ready rooms. The pilots she trained. The lives they saved. The tradition that would continue long after she was gone. Alara Vance touched her father's wings one more time, smiled, and went to prepare for tomorrow. If this story moved you, drop a comment and tell us about someone who believed in you when others did not. Or share this with a person who needs to hear that courage has no gender. We would love to hear your story.